Really? Well, in order to deny that it's from God, you have to admit a few things, don't you? You have to admit, apparently there's a Jesus guy, and apparently he was crucified, and apparently there was darkness. You're just describing it in a different way. So you had to reluctantly admit these three facts in order to make a denial about Jesus. You see how you backed in? I wasn't there doing a robbery. I was just making a deposit. You've backed in that you were there. They're backing into this. Tacitus is a very well-known historian. He says he has to back into these facts in his claim that consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, probably the resurrection, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, just like South Orange County, right? That's where we're from. There you go. So you've got to back in to these reluctant admissions about Jesus to make this kind of a claim. These are not Christ followers. Here's a guy named Marabar Serapeon, who's a Syrian philosopher, talking to his son about several leaders. He mentions a wise king, a Jewish wise king, that the Jews actually murdered their own wise king, and after that their kingdom was abolished. He's got to back into some more facts. And here's Phlegon, who backs into two really interesting sets of facts. He says that Jesus had a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. And while alive was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. These guys don't believe this is true. They're just reporting the earliest accounts that they're hearing as well as non-believers. If you wonder when these accounts began, you can have certainty they were early. And these reluctant admissions, if you lost every single piece of Christian scripture and all the church fathers, and all you had was the writing of these pagans, that's what you would know about Jesus. Not bad.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker. Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
How did they miss this?
A Huntington Beach man is behind bars tonight, accused of a murder more than 30 years ago.
We're looking for the thing that's really hiding in plain sight. Which of these things in this crime scene doesn't fit this scene? For me, this is a calling.
Yeah, I'm clearly an evidentialist. That's just my perspective as a skeptic. That was what I valued, making cases, making criminal cases. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that when I began to examine Christianity, that's the approach I took. I think what we're seeing in the church is that the greater and greater need for case making.
A man is arrested outside his home accused of having a role in the 1981 disappearance of his wife.
Carol vanished 30 years ago, leaving behind her two children, Mikey and Brandy.
The family would have been more than happy to believe that Carol is still out there somewhere.
If Carol was dead, if Mike killed her, taking the accusation to court would be risky. But Prosecutor Lewin decided to roll the dice. On April 13th, 2011, Mike was arrested for Carol's murder.
I've learned enough, I think, to be able to help the church do what it needs to do, to understand how evidence is processed, to understand how we put the case together, to understand how powerful the circumstantial case is, but also what we believe about the foundational views we have as Christians in a culture that is becoming more and more non-Christian. Now is the time. This is the time when we need to get serious about how to present it to a culture which is challenging what we believe more and more every day.
Okay, there you saw two forms of corroborative evidence. Now, when I do this talk, I always trying to abbreviate the work of the book, Cold Case Christianity, and make it visual for our audiences so they can kind of see what we're getting at here. And I think what you saw there, I hope you understood the difference here between these two forms of evidence, this indirect physical evidence of archaeology, which I think is very, very powerful, especially when you compare the archaeological support for other ancient theistic systems like Mormonism or others that make claims. Remember, this is a very different kind of a system. I've said it here a couple of weeks ago on our show. This is a claim made publicly about an event in history, rooted in history. It's not a private vision that can't be verified or falsified. This is a claim about history, so it can be verified or falsified. So you have this kind of physical evidence. Then you have the evidence of the corroborative statements. And I tried to stay as early as I can. I do sometimes see apologists step out into statements about Christians made in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Those things would not be as powerful to me as an investigator. I want to know, how early is the story of Jesus being circulated? And are the only ones circulating the story Christians? It turns out the story of Jesus is circulating very early, and it's very robust in terms of its pieces, you know, the supernatural. Again, what I'm also looking for is, are the earliest versions of the Christian story somehow less supernatural than the later ones? Because that would give me pause, right? Because that, I'm starting to think, if that's the case, then the earliest versions of Jesus, maybe he's just a simple itinerant preacher who kind of says some nice moral statements, but in the end makes does not perform any miracles, doesn't walk on water, doesn't rise from the dead, not born of a virgin, all the supernatural aspects. If you're going to tell this lie about Jesus and make him sound like God, you're going to have to either do it one of two ways: late in history or out of the region. If in fact the earliest stories are early in history and start in the region and all the supernatural elements are still in place, that's a problem. Because clearly there should be somebody there who would have known the real Jesus to say, hey, time out. That guy was none of that. He was a good guy, but he was none of that. And that's the problem you have. I think the corroboration we see is, again, touch point corroboration. If you think that any piece of evidence corroborating any statement gives you an entire picture, like a video, you're just wrong. That's just not the nature of corroborative evidence. And every day we use what I call touch point evidence. You saw it in the video. That it helps jurors understand or come to confidence that they're hearing truth from the witness, even though we haven't covered everything like a video, even though it's some small fraction of the larger account. There are going to be times when you're going to have to trust an eyewitness for something. You corroborate as best as you can, but you're still going to trust the eyewitness ultimately in the final call. Now, one more thing. You'll see that in this video, all we did was talk about two pieces of corroborative evidence. In the book, Cold Case Christianity, I talk about many more. As a matter of fact, I'm always kind of bummed when I do this talk publicly that I don't have time to go into all. I should just do one talk on corroboration, that one aspect, and that's it. Because there are internal pieces of evidence also, which we will cover here in future episodes here at Cold Case Christianity. For example, a great bit of work was done in the last 10 years on the pronouns, personal pronouns, names of characters in ancient literature, in ancient accounts. In the 1st century or before the 1st century, 2nd century, in different regions of the known world. So, for example, we can assemble all the names used for men and the Jewish names used for women, say in Egypt in the 1st century. It turns out the names used for men and women, Jewish names for men and women in the 1st century in Egypt, are different than the names used for Jewish men and women in Israel. So this is a good way of comparing. If I'm writing an account from Egypt and writing fiction, I'm not going to know what the popular names were in Israel. I know what the popular names are here, but how am I going to guess what the popular names are there? Especially if I'm writing this late. If the claim is it's being written out of the region late, well, it's interesting that it turns out the authors know from the work we've done now determining what are the popular names in Israel in the 1st century. It turns out they're all the names that are used in Scripture. So if you're writing this from Egypt, you're going to have a hard time making that kind of a guess. Also, it's clear that the authors of Scripture are very familiar with the geography, the cities. These things are all accurate. You'll notice, for example, in late accounts in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century about Jesus, written in North Africa, with some of the same accounts that have some of the miracles, the infancy gospels, these things we know are not real. We know they're not true. But interestingly about those is you'll see that they don't wander off into the same kind of minutia that the Gospels do. Because clearly the authors who are writing this are writing way far from the action, both geographically and chronologically. So they don't have access to what's happening in Israel in the 1st century. It appears that the authors of the Gospels did. So it's just another form of internal evidence. Also, there's a thing which I call unintentional eyewitness support. A pastor in the 19th century called J.J. Blunt called this the undesigned coincidences of the Gospels. And here what you have are, and some of those things that Blunt talks about are interesting, but the ones I'm only interested in are the things that actually apply to eyewitness accounts. And here's what I mean by that. There are times when 2 eyewitnesses will provide you details that seem to be somewhat different. That's very common. As a matter of fact, that's pretty much every case I've ever worked. But what's even more interesting is when an eyewitness provides you with something that raises a question, and you're thinking, wait a minute, how can that even be true? And it's not until you talk to the other witness that they provide you some other detail, inadvertently, that solves the clue, it solves the mystery that was caused by the first eyewitness account. This unintentional eyewitness support, where people provide details that help the puzzle fit together, you see throughout the Gospels. And I talk about this at length in coldcasechristianity.com. So, at both the website and the book. Now, so you'll see though that in this video, all we talked about was just the 2 forms of archaeological support and what I call reluctant admissions of people who don't want to support the story of Jesus. They actually deny the deity of Jesus. They deny all of it, but it turns out they have to offer you some support for this account even as they deny the account altogether. That's a kind of interesting way to see people back into a claim. I think that does count as good evidence for Christianity's veracity in the Gospels. All right, so now you've seen 2 pieces of evidence. Let's go back and kind of close this circle. When we talk about whether something's reliable and whether it's reasonable to believe that it's reliable, remember, the standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt. Do we wish we had better corroboration? Do I wish we had better corroboration? Yeah, but I can tell you this. I can't think of an ancient account about anyone, if it's Caesar, if it's anyone in history, that as old as the story of Jesus, that is as corroborated as well as the Jesus account. Oh my gosh, if you look at other ancient stories, both in terms of the number of documents that describe the events, how early those documents are in history to the events, how they've been handled over time since the event, you're not going to find anything that's as well corroborated as the story of Jesus, period. Now, do I wish we had video? Yeah, don't we all? Do I wish we had something? There's 1,000 things I could think of I wish we had. But in every cold case I've ever worked, I've always been in that position where I'm saying the same thing. There's 1,000 things I wish the detectives would have said, would have done, would have collected, would have preserved. But you have what you have. And in terms of the Jesus story, I think we have more than enough to know that these are reliable accounts. I hope this week's show has helped you to kind of feel the same way, to determine this is actually a reasonable inference from the evidence, given what we've seen so far. And I'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.